by giving me an audio cue, just because I won't be looking at the chat till the very end. This is going to be a jam-packed talk because we have 100 slides. We have just under an hour to get through all of this. Some of this for those of you who have been to my previous talks, some of it will be rehashing some of that. I've tried to spend a dedicated portion to talking about psychology, performance on Mars, because that is the title of this talk. But I do want those of you who are unfamiliar with the challenges of the spaceflight environment, as well as emerging technologies, to have a sense of what is out there, how we handle space, and why we need to prepare for space. So away we go. You heard a little bit about my background. My name is Dr. Shawna Pandya. I am a Canadian physician, scientist, astronaut candidate, aquanaut, explorer, and a lot more, but you've already heard the background, so we don't need to rehash it. So on to the next slide. Doing that. All right, so I have a lot of affiliations, no conflicts of interest. I'm not being paid to do this talk. And rather than go over all of them, I think the relevant ones will come out through this talk. So by the end of this talk, my hope is that you have a sense of the hazards of the spaceflight environment, the psychological challenges for exploration class missions, and the tools that we use to optimize our performance on Mars and beyond. Okay, so let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine that you are part of a crew headed to Mars today. So first of all, congratulations on your selection. So my question to you is, how are you going to prepare for space? So let's talk about space flight in general, what we know from decades of low Earth orbit and decades of human space flight. And when we talk about the challenges of the space flight environment, this is actually a whole laundry list of problems. And basically includes everything from increased radiation to the acceleration, deceleration loads of launch, altered gravity, altered day-night cycles, confined spaces, temperature extremes, psychologically demanding, which file that away because we're going to talk about that in greater detail. But just for context, on the International Space Station, when we talk about a psychologically demanding operational environment, remember, you are in an isolated and confined space. You're away from the creature comforts of home. And just know that your operational schedule is scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. So you have to be on top of it and be able to deal with a rapidly changing environment and stress load. Your resource and remote and resource limited. You have to trust your the fidelity and the engineering of your spacecraft to protect you from the hazards of the spaceflight environment. That includes everything from those temperature extremes we mentioned, that increased radiation, the risk of solar flares, the vacuum of space, the threat of space debris. You have to trust the engineering of your closed loop life support system. So that means trust it to provide the adequate temperature, humidity, and also scrub the atmosphere of noxious gases. And then you have to also realize and acknowledge that you're going to have to contend with the everyday lumps and bumps of everything that you might encounter on Earth, like skin infections, skin irritation, bladder infections, abrasions, trauma. Okay, and then when we talk about spaceflight in general, everyone's mind immediately goes to what we think of when we think of space, and that is microgravity. And so we're going to focus on weightlessness for the first part of this talk, although I know ultimately we're moving towards Mars. And that's because we have billions of years of evolution telling us how we do in 1G, and the answer is surprisingly well. And we have decades of human spaceflight data that say how we do in microgravity. And we just don't know what comes in between. We know that every single bodily system is affected by the microgravity environment. We've seen that on ISS, we've seen that Skylab, Mir, Gemini, Apollo. And basically, we know that our bones lose density at a rate of 1.5% per month, and that without mitigation, that reflects an osteoporotic state on Earth. We know that our muscles, again, without intervention, lose mass. We know that fluids shift upwards, and that has multiple effects, everything from making us more predisposed to kidney stones, to our hearts and baroreceptors interpreting this as an increased fluid load and peeing out more for the first few days in weightlessness, to feeling more facial congestion in space. So that means we are more prone to congestion headaches. Food doesn't taste as good. It needs to be more flavorful. We also know that our inner ears get totally confused because now we don't know which way is up, which way is down, famously making us prone to space adaptation sickness in the first few days in space. So that's why we don't schedule critical events like a spacewalk, because it would be super gross and also really hazardous to throw up in a spacesuit on EVA. And the data keeps emerging. So this is the neuroscience group. I don't think it's of surprise to anyone or news to anyone that there are central nervous system effects. And the biggest one would be the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome, or SANS for short. And this is a relatively new phenomenon described over the past 15 years or so. And basically what we've learned about astronauts in long duration space flight, so over 30 days or more, is that for reasons that we're still delineating, but thought to be related to altered drainage of cerebrospinal fluid. So that's that brain juice that bathes our spines and our brains. There's impaired drainage, impaired lymphatic drainage, and impaired venous drainage from around our brains, resulting in unevenly distributed increased pressure around specific parts of our brain, and very interestingly enough, around our optic nerves. And that, you know, the eyeballs, just being an extension of our nervous system, are also impacted. So the shape of our globe flattens. We see increased folds at the backs of our eyeballs. And we see that, you know, in certain populations, this can actually have visual effects like hyperopia. For reasons that we still aren't clear on, it predominantly affects males. So the data is emerging. There's continuous surprises in spaceflight. We know that there's gender differences when it comes to spaceflight. We know that, for example, males are more predominantly predisposed to the SANS that we just talked about, to hearing loss. Women are more exposed to bladder infections because of the shorter urethra and in altered fluid cohesive properties of something like urine in the microgravity environment. And we know that women are more prone to fainting and orthostatic hypotension or fainting post-flight. So there's differences when it comes to gender bases in certain physiological respects. But we also know in certain important facets like performance and cognition, we don't see any pertinent differences. And the surprises keep coming. So as recently as 2019, when a routine handheld ultrasound experiment on the International Space Station, they were just trying to see how an ultrasound worked and what the venous drainage looked like in space. And lo and behold, they found a giant blood clot in space. In the jugular veins while in space, leading us to ask, well, now does being in space and altered gravity make us more prone to forming blood clots? And then also adding to the data that keeps emerging after all this time, there's still surprises. So just last month, by a Canadian group of researchers, we found out that part of the reason that we have decreased blood cell masses, red blood cell mass in space, is because there's increased red blood cell breakdown during long duration spaceflight. So all of this is to say, this crash course in space medicine is to say, if you want to sum it down to one key phrase, it's that space is trying to kill you. And remember, this is a Mars-focused talk, so this is all we know from decades of research from low Earth orbit. So then that begs the question, what happens when we go beyond low Earth orbit? And that's an important question to ask because it's not theoretical. If you're here in this group, you know that the international community led by NASA and the major space agencies, including ESA, CSA, and their partners, have plans to go to the moon and beyond, starting with Lunar Gateway as early as 2022 for assembly and construction, with plans to have a non-continuously crewed, smaller than ISS space station in orbit around the moon. So it'll be the first deep space station, which blows my mind. There'll be toddlers born for whom just knowing that we have humans in deep space is normal. So the mandate is, again, non-continuously crewed. I think 3 to 6 crew members is the projection for 30 to 60 days at a time, with a view towards accomplishing Earth observation, lunar observation, sun observation, astronomy, and also serving as a waypoint to both the moon surface and Mars. And interestingly enough, we're talking about circadian rhythms and how that matters. And so here's another example. So on the ISS, ISS rotates at a rate of 90 minutes around the Earth. So you're experiencing 16 sunrise sunset cycles per 24-hour period. With the halo orbit, that gateway, the sunrise sunset period takes place, the equivalent of a day on gateway is 7 Earth days. So again, you have to contend with those altered circadian rhythms. So continuing on with how this gets us to Mars. So this is a step in the international roadmap for Artemis. And this is probably review for a lot of you, but Artemis is the follow-up to Apollo that plans to put the first person of color and next man on the moon as early as 2024, with a view towards establishing permanent surface operations on the moon by the end of the decade, with objectives accomplishing science, exploration, as well as serving as a test bed for what we're all here to talk about, Mars. So this talk about sending humans to Mars and how we maintain performance isn't theoretical, because this is really a part of the international roadmap. This is a snapshot of NASA's plans to Mars. And it's also backed up by the commercial entities. So Elon Musk has famously said that he wants to send millions of humans to Mars as early as the next decade. So then what happens? How does health become complicated, increasingly complicated, by the time that we go to the moon or Mars? So what additional health challenges do we have to worry about? So we know from the Apollo era that lunar regolith, lunar dust, was a very real health challenge, in that it was a skin irritant, respiratory irritant, and it just clogged up the joints of the EVA suits, or extravehicular activity suits, of the Apollo astronauts. So to anyone who says that the moon landing was fake, I say that they put a lot of effort into it, because there's thousands of pages of documentation dedicated to the lunar dust and results from the scientific expeditions of Apollo. Moving on, so we alluded to this in the very first slide, but now let's focus on the radiation problem in greater detail. So the bottom line is, the further out you go, the more you have to contend with in terms of radiation. So we know that within the confines of the Van Allen belts in Earth, low Earth orbit around Earth, you're still relatively protected from the troublesome higher energy ionizing radiation that can affect one's health. So things like solar particle flares, solar particle events, galactic cosmic rays, which are higher radiation, more deleterious to our health, are filtered out by the magnetosphere and Van Allen belts. By the time we travel to the moon and Mars, we don't have that protection. And so then we have to worry more about yearly limits, career limits, and also differential how that's differentially affects different organs and genders. So women, for example, with reproductive organs are more prone to radiation damage. So there are more stringent career and yearly limits for women for that reason, for example. And if you wanted to summarize how radiation affects us, the higher out we go, the more of a concern this is. And so for comparison, if we say that you're the equivalent of 1 unit of radiation when you're on the Earth's surface, when you're taking a transatlantic flight, you're about 40-fold exposure, 250 times on the ISS, and by the time you're in deep space, 700-fold plus increased energy of the nature of the radiation you're exposed to. And so 1 day in space is pretty much equivalent to being on Earth for a whole year. And when you're traveling to Mars, remember that's a 6 to 9 month journey, you're experiencing the equivalent of 1 full body CT scan every 5 to 6 days. So speaking of distances, we just talked about travel time. How does that impact our crew on Mars? And this is where we're starting to get into the psychology, is isolation. So for those of you who are Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans out there, you may have heard of the Douglas Adams quote, "Space is big." So vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big, you wouldn't believe it. So what that translates to is communication delays, because light can only travel so fast across these different distances. So when we're sending out telecommunication signals, depending on the alignment of the Earth and Mars, you can expect a 6 to 48-minute round trip communication delay. So now imagine you're an astronaut on Mars, your kid just had their birthday, you want to phone them, you want to say, hey, how's it going? You can't do that in real time, and that's going to have real psychological impacts. And so when we talk about how space health in general becomes that much more complicated in exploration class missions, it can be further broken down into many sub categories. But this includes everything from how the crew interacts with each other, to how the crew interacts with technologies, to how the crew de-skills over time, and the list goes on and on and on. And basically, when we summarize all of these challenges for exploration class missions, we talk about them as the big five. We talked about altered gravity environments, distance from Earth, increased radiation, and now what we're going to focus on for the next part of this talk, isolation and confinement and hostile environments. So this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of how performance and what performance concerns we have to think about when it comes to living and working and staying productive and maintaining good mental health on Mars. So the next few slides are from an excellent book by Nick Canis called Humans in Space. It's a short read. It's about 150 pages. And here's some of the highlights. So let's talk quickly about the stressors of spaceflight in greater detail. So we talked about how sleep is altered. Part of that is from the circadian rhythm disruptions that we've talked about. Part of it is from being in a totally different environment. You can't sleep on your stomach and lie flat in space if that's how you normally sleep on Earth. We know that due to, in microgravity at least, and remember that you're going to right now expect to be weightless on the way to Mars for 6 to 9 months. We know that there's no convection in microgravity. So that means things like CO2 that we expire tend to pool up by our faces as we sleep, leading to things like CO2 headaches. Because of this altered sense of time, how we perceive time is altered, and that extends to how we visually and auditorily perceive our environments. And even, we talked about this a little bit earlier, how we perceive our spatial orientation. Part of this does adapt over time as we get over, as the inner ear gets over the new changes to the microgravity environment. But we also know from things like the NASA twin study published in 2017, this is published in Science. So Scott Kelly went to space for a year. Mark Kelly, his twin brother, stayed on Earth. We know that there's also cognitive effects and this kind of cognitive-like fog that happens from being in the spaceflight environment. And we don't know why. Is it one thing versus the other? Is it a synergistic effect of increased radiation, highly scheduled pace, very stressful, being in this resource poor environment, as well as having to contend with the physiological effects of increased fluid shift upwards and being in microgravity? There's a lot to be unpacked there. We know that there is evidence of, in addition to that, cognition, so that extends to performance, memory, psychomotor issues. Then there's physiological effects that we kind of alluded to that compound this. So imagine that you have a headache, okay, and you want to take Tylenol. How is that Tylenol going to be processed differently, or paracetamol, acetaminophen, because this is an international audience? How is that Tylenol going to be processed differently, knowing that we are experiencing fluid shifts, that we experience delayed gastric emptying and decreased intestinal absorption in space, hepatic metabolism may be altered, protein binding, renal excretion might be altered. And then there's the macro levels. So we just talked about pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics. What about crew interaction? There's a lot of research around this. And, some of it's conflicting. So group size, there's proposals for crews of 4 to 6 for Martian profiles. That seems to be a number that that works in terms of crew logistics, crew dynamics. And then there's conflicting research out there on what cultural differences, how cultural differences impact crew dynamics. So I've read that the more cultural heterogeneity there is, the more likely there is to be a conflict. Practically speaking, when speaking with astronauts on the ISS, they say, no, that's not the case. You know, they're like family. We've lived and trained together. Group heterogeneity, there is both evidence for all female crews, but also gender diverse crews. So all of these kind of point to the same thing: cultural differences, whether there's stemming from language differences, personal experience, group and gender differences. Remember, we're also putting these astronauts in a resource poor environment, so they have limited experience for novelty, so the boredom can compound that. And then also how the crew is structured. I didn't find the graphic in time for this talk, but there was one interesting psychological paper that looked at crew leader dynamics over time. And what's really interesting is basically people seem to get sick of the leader. And if you look at the web model of how people are intentionally first off reacting with the leader, they're communicating directly, and then over time the leader stays around alone in the center, and then people are communicating with each other indirectly with the leader. So, you know, looking at how conflict resolution and preparing ourselves for conflict resolution, which we're actually going to talk about in a few slides, becomes important for performance challenges on Mars. Okay, so when we talk about, again, the problem space of performance on Mars, what are other sources of psychological stressors? We just talked about interpersonal effects. We're also looking at how we mitigate that. So we're going to talk about tools for prevention in the next section if we have time. But, you know, selecting for people who are mission focused, who can work equally well as a team, but also work well independently. I've seen evidence for and against this. There's being aware of something called the third quarter phenomenon. And so this is when you're 3/4 of the way through your mission, whether you're on an analog study and an Antarctic study, Antarctic deployment, and you kind of just, you know, lose interest, become distressed with the length of time of the mission you're in, which can have effects like increased irritability, decreased mission focus, decreased motivation. And the latest research I've seen on the subject suggests that this is indeed a real phenomenon and something to be aware of. And if we're aware of it, maybe we can mitigate it. Again, there's the fact that we're, you know, several hundreds of millions of miles and kilometers from home. Asthenia. So this is a psychological term that was mainly coined on the Russian cosmonaut side, but the best way I can translate it is maybe anhedonia, or kind of an apathy. It's a form of depression, of not really feeling, caring, sensing as much. We're going to talk about habitability in the next few slides. And then also post-return adjustment. So these are all of these things, you know, from starting from the day you're selected. Yeah, it's great stress, but it's still stress. And then training for the mission, living with the mission, and then also coming back to Earth. You know, we talked a little bit about this on the last slide. Where do we get interpersonal conflict from? So basically, anywhere there's a difference, whether it's, you know, your spot on the crew, your role on the crew, your background, your personal experiences, and also even having just a conflict and maybe not resolving that conflict. And so on the actually, maybe I'll talk about that in a few slides about how we mitigate that. So here's a few. I've also written a book chapter on the subject of psychosocial resilience in long duration spaceflight. So the next two slides are kind of looking at some of the protective factors. And so we talk about resilience in spaceflight. And when we talk about psychosocial resilience, that is the ability to express mental grit, to bounce back from failures, and to basically have that toughness of mind to deal with adverse scenarios. And it's really interesting to think, to see that it's not an innate trait. It's not something that we're born with, but it's something that we can learn and apply over time. And that's particularly relevant in this day and age, because maybe we're not all going to Mars, but we're all living in this form of austerity, isolation, quarantine in the global pandemic. And so when we talk about ways to cultivate resilience, there's multiple models out there. This is one that I've liked ever since I've come across it. And it comes to breaking things down. So if you have a monumental task, not looking at the enormity of the task, but looking at first steps, and positive self-talk, telling yourself that you've got this, mental rehearsal, so preparing for the best and worst case scenarios, impulse control, so giving in that urge to give into negativity or giving up, and then also positive social supports, and that's where the crew comes in. And then there's also research on coping in austere environments, and it's very similar to the research on resilience. And so that, when you're coping in a resource poor austere environment, it comes down to planful problem solving. So just like in resilience, there's that breaking things down, enduring harsh conditions, there's that impulse control, seeking social supports, relying on your team and your crew, emphasizing the positives, that includes positive self-talk. And then this one's a little bit different, realizing that it's not all in your control, but relying on luck. So I want to introduce to you a concept that I really find helpful when talking about this, and this is salutogenesis. So this is from the popular or positive psychology world, and it basically means rising to the occasion. So we notice there's a subset of person who views austere environments, like going to Antarctica, living on a submarine for months, choosing to run a 100-mile ultramarathon, and views it as an opportunity for self-growth, for personal growth, for enjoying the moment. And so I explore this more in detail in my book chapter that I sent you or put the resource reference to. But this is a really good umbrella summary, and it's really interesting because this is actually taken from an obstetrical paper, but I thought it actually summarized what salutogenesis is. And so it looks at kind of positive assets that you have within your psychological arsenal to maintain, going to a place like Mars, being there on a 3 to 5 year mission profile, and saying, hey, what can I get from this? How is this a challenge? How am I going to grow from this? And so gratitude is a part of it, self-sufficiency, resilience, hardiness, having good crew dynamics, empathy. Also reacting to adverse events with humor. And then there's also assets there that you can look at and see how that they might lead to increased performance or increased coping, at least on Mars. And here's another interesting resource. So this is called the Handbook of Salutogenesis, because now imagine you send 2 people to Mars. One has a kind of positive growth mindset, salutogenic approach, and one is kind of like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Everything, the sky is falling, everything's bad, nothing works. And so with the salutogenic approach, it's not just black and white. It's not just either or. It's, if you're sick, well, you're sick on a spectrum. It could be worse. What do you have in your arsenal from your previous experience to help you learn and overcome the situation? What factors, resources do you have in your environment with respect to your team? And how much has stress help you? Remember, there's such thing as positive stress. How are you going to adapt to the situation? Whereas on the pathogenic side, it's sort of like black and white. Okay, this is bad, this is good. You kind of amplify bad events. All stress is bad. You want a magic bullet cure to cure your situation, essentially. So the other thing I want to talk about that I haven't put into the slides is a model that NASA calls good expeditionary behavior. And maybe in a later version of these slides, I'll include a link to resources. So at the start of the pandemic, NASA astronaut Anne McLean included a really great tutorial on what good expeditionary or good EP is and why it matters. And so we talked about, the resources of your crew, being an ideal crewmate. And this means being mission focused, being focused on your own health, being focused on the crew of the team, having a good approach to conflict resolution, and also being able to kind of keep a pulse on the overall health of both yourself and the team. And so it's a really interesting term, and it's something that NASA really and all the governmental space agencies really look for in selection, as well as build during training. So you'll see the latest NASA class just came back from survival school, and part of it is needing the survival skills, but also building that crew cohesion and practicing those good EP behaviors. Okay, so now we're getting a little more into emerging research and a little bit theoretical. So one question I like to ask is, well, how do we make an austere environment less austere? Why do we have to just deal with the fact that we're going to Mars for 5 years? And if you want to, you know, do something fun like go play basketball, well, you have to wait for 5 years to go back on Earth. So let's look at things that I would like to see explored and things that are also being explored in the literature. So the first question I want to ask is there a role for pets on Mars? We know anyone who has a pet out there, whether it's a dog or a cat, those of you who follow me on social media know I'm a crazy bird person. You know that the emotional comfort that they can offer. And so here's a trade-off. You know, we know that they're going to consume resources. We know that there's going to be physiological deterioration. But if you take something that's, you know, small, minimal resource consumption that can be bred ethically or reproduced ethically, the challenges of reproducing in microgravity and ultragravity notwithstanding, that can use minimal resources like a gerbil, a hamster, a parakeet. Maybe there's a role for that in building up crew morale. On the downside, you have to argue, well, okay, well, they're going to use resources. That's more oxygen consumed, that's more food consumed, that's more waste generated, that's more water drank. And also, what happens if Fido dies on Mars? Well, then there's a new crew morale issue to contend with. I think it's worth exploring, but there are pros and cons. Okay, we talked about the creature comforts. Oh, I just want to take a break here, but since we're talking about pigeons on Mars in space or birds in space. So people have actually run this experiment. What do birds do in microgravity? This is from a Russian flight, parabolic flight, and it's really interesting to see how these guys adapt to microgravity. So this always makes me laugh because, you know, they look ridiculous, but you can see there's also adaptation there. They're actively avoiding hitting the walls in real time in microgravity. Okay, so continuing on this theme of how do we make an austere environment less austere? Well, how do we build up creature comfort? So here's a really ridiculous concept. This is what that. Sorry. Let me just advance past this. Perfect. So when we talk about, you know, the extreme case of bringing creature comforts, well, what if we create, you know, the first Mars Bucks, a Starbucks on Mars, you know, and then that way we can actually go and have our morning espresso or latte. I know for me that having caffeine on Mars would be an absolute bonus and would be a deal maker. So these are all theoretical concepts, but let's bring it back to actual research that's being out there. So we know, for example, in the habitat world, habitat design is taken very seriously, both in terms of the things we need to keep us alive, so protect us from the elements, protect us from radiation, optimize the efficiency of our closed loop life support, but also the things that contribute to mental well-being, that contribute to productivity and health. So that includes engineering lighting that is more reminiscent of circadian rhythms, as well as engineering spaces to protect crew privacy. And there's evidence for saying that the more privacy we respect, the more it contributes to overall crew well-being. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to preparing for space. We know, so we're going to switch back to looking at tools that we know help us prepare for spaceflight knowing all of the hazards that we face. And so, for example, when we talk about preparing for human spaceflight, even on the ISS now, it starts with risk mitigation. It starts with selection. There's specific select in, select out criteria, even on the psychological front. So NASA candidates are famously asked to fill out a 600 personality, 600 question personality battery to filter out subtle and select out criteria. Having a history of psychosis, bipolar disease, schizophrenia right now are select out criteria. We know that in terms of mental health monitoring and countermeasures, there's regular conferences with the crew flight surgeon, with the crew psychologist, and with family. These are regularly scheduled. So then, and this is a matter of risk mitigation. So then the question we have to ask is, well, how do we evolve that for a place like Mars where you cannot have a real-time conversation with the flight surgeon or with your kid on their birthday? We know in terms of prediction, we have computer modeling tools that help us prepare for what to pack with us. So this is a snapshot of the integrated medical model, and it lets us extrapolate the amount of crew medical kit contents we'll need based on the length of our crew, the number of people going, and our acceptable limits of risk. We also have more dynamic models, like the Medical Extensible Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment tool. So we call it MedPrep because that's super cumbersome to say, but it allows us to predict for multiple medical events, psychological, physiological, and otherwise, as well as various countermeasures. So if there's an active case of psychosis en route to Mars, what is your countermeasure for that? And then what possible crew outcomes can that generate? And so when we look at everything we have to contend on a deep space mission, here's a snapshot of the top 100 medical conditions. This is a snapshot from the Exploration Medical Capabilities Integrated Medical Model medical conditions. And we can see that, yeah, there's everyday things like lumps and bumps and traumas, but we just saw a few slides ago that isolation and confinement has its own major category, and we have to be prepared for psychosis and the adverse effects of isolation and confinement. We also have to take into consideration how we're going to prepare for all of these performance issues, prepare not to just mitigate adverse performance and psychological effects, but enhance performance, all while knowing the constraints of packing for space. So this is known as the backpacking principle. You can't take it all with you. One thing that you bring is at the expense of the other. I call it the Aladdin principle. Phenomenal cosmic power to get to Mars, itty bitty living space once you get there. So your packing principles are that everything that you bring with you has to be low cost, low volume, low mass, low power, easy to use. It has to have a long shelf life, radiation resistant, and as a bonus, be low crew time to use. And so here's another way of contextualizing all of these constraints in the context of the psychology, optimizing psychological performance on Mars. So communications, both with Earth as well as within the crew. And then also being aware of the lack of resupply, component degradations. We just talked about needing a long shelf life, as well as what are required resources and what redundancies can we build in to help that. So space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. And we actually learn a lot about preparing for this high risk, high isolated environment through analogous or like environments on Earth, whether we're talking about remote villages in Africa, whether we're talking about Antarctic deployments, or whether we're talking about an analog mission to the Aquarius Reef Base. So I'm going to go through this section a little bit quicker so we can get back to emerging solutions for enhancing performance on Mars. But basically, there's multiple value from multiple different types of environments to prepare us for deep space missions. And so we learn a lot from altered gravity environments, whether we're talking about parabolic flight, or I'm going to skip past this video. through creating altered gravity environments through gravity offset harnesses, preparing ourselves through centrifuge training for the increased G loads of launch and landing. We learn a lot through water analogs by simulating emergency scenarios. So for example, simulating emergency post-landing operations. This is some of the work we've done with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences, testing IVA or intravehicular activity suits in water. We learn a lot about practicing our maneuvers underwater. So this is a neutral buoyancy lab that we've created underwater. So just like NASA has created a full-scale replica of the ISS underwater at Johnson Space Center, we've created a scale-down mock-up to allow us to practice how to fix a module outside the ISS. So again, there's that building in resilience through training in a like environment. So you're practicing for the best and the worst case scenarios. We also learn a lot by creating isolation environments underwater. So this is the Neptune mission where we earned our aquanaut designation in 2019. And so this stood for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. We lived as a crew of 5 underwater for 5 days. And NASA does the exact same thing, NASA, ESA, CSA, and their partners, so like JAXA. So this is the Aquarius Reef Base where NASA runs its NASA Extreme Environment Mission operations. And basically the idea is you're going down, you're sending your crew of astronauts and scientists for a period of 8 to 16 days, both to do science and technology demonstrations, but also to reinforce those crew dynamics in isolation, because at 60 feet underwater, you're in saturation. And if you don't surface at a set rate, you can risk a dive injury. That's through decompression illness. And so at the Aquarius Reef Base, you cannot surface immediately in case of an emergency. You have to wait 16 hours and 47 minutes. So you truly are isolated from topside support. If there's a medical emergency, if there's acute psychosis, if there's interpersonal conflict. So for comparison as to how good an analog this is, you can actually get to definitive medical care from the International Space Station much more quickly than you can on the order of hours sooner than at NEMO. We also learn a lot from analog missions in isolated confined environments. So there's lots of examples. This is some snapshots from the Mars Desert Research Station. Again, you're living and working as a crew on Mars, bringing your own science and operations. And then even using real-time environments like operational environments. So for example, crew resource management during a research mission on an pressurized flight at 19,000 feet. That's what we were doing here in this image in 2017, and also creating your own type of resource limitations. So this is snapshots from our Operational Space Medicine course in the Colorado wilderness, where we're essentially depriving our medics of their resources and saying, okay, how do you deal with this? How do you create your own resources? And so all this is to say that, there's a lot of ways to prepare for space. And in the final few minutes here in this talk, I just want to talk about emerging technologies that we have to help us prepare for space. So when we talk about these challenges for Mars, we should also look at opportunities. So the question that I ask is, what emerging technologies can we use to enhance performance on Mars? And so I think we should be looking at ideas from science fiction as well as what's out there right now. So, can we get over the boredom and physiological losses from either teleporting to Mars or bringing gravity with us, like in Space Odyssey 2001? Can we create rich environments through creating avatars in virtual reality? Can we help overcome the physiological decompensation that occurs through exoskeletons? Can we overcome de-skilling by training in VR? And the answer is yes. So I know in previous proposals for mental health with TRISH, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, there have been proposals for looking at VR buddies, VR pets to maintain mental health, both on Earth and in spaceflight missions. And that kind of comes back to the question of, well, how about bringing a pet to space for keeping up crew morale without dealing with resource utilization or crew morale issues if the pet dies? In this scenario, this is some of my work with a Canadian company called Luxsonic Technologies. to enhance performance by allowing astronauts to practice specific medical skills in virtual reality. And we've also created modules for the Canadian Space Agency for this effect. We can look at genetic enhancement. So this is really future looking to engineer astronauts that are more resilient to these hostile environments. So we know, we discussed this earlier, there are definitive cognitive effects in this high radiation, highly operational, altered gravity environment. And we know there's actually precedent for using genetic enhancement to enhance performance in space. So this is the Mighty Mouse experiment from 2020 that came back from the IIAS, showing that genetically engineered muscular little mice have less bone and muscle loss than non-genetically engineered little mice. So there is precedent for that. So why not for cognitive enhancement? So in the last few slides here, what about nutrition? This is a company in disclosure that I advise, and their idea, in addition to providing low mass, long shelf life, nutritious food, is encompassing nootropics or cognition enhancing components into the food to help enhance performance. So the company is called Astrius, and they've also advanced to the NASA CSA Space Health Challenge next round. We've talked briefly about gravity. So what about enhancing performance physiologically and psychologically by bringing the gravity with us? So this is a company called Orbital Assembly Corporation, which proposes exactly what you see in Space Odyssey 2001, creating a rotating partial gravity space station as a product of, or as a factor of, the rate of rotation and the radius of the space station to help mitigate some of those effects. And then looking more futuristically, there are people out there, including and entities out there, including the European Space Agency, which have looked at studies for human hibernation to alleviate both the physiological losses, the psychological boredom, as well as the resource utilization for sending humans to far off destinations like Mars. And then there's people who say, well, you know, another way to mitigate that would be by getting to Mars faster. So here's a concept for the Vasimir plasma engine, sending to humans to Mars instead of 6 to 9 months in as little as 39 days. So the bottom line is, when we talk about challenges for not just surviving, but thriving on Mars, we're going to have to science the space out of this and be really resourceful with a little bit of MacGyvering as well. And so as we look to the future, we're going to have to change business as usual. We're going to have to ask questions about selection. Does that need to change? Does training need to change along with that? Do we need to be really radical and say, you know, optimize their self-sufficiency? So here's a snapshot from a Soviet surgeon who had to take out his own appendix in Antarctica because he was the only doctor there. So what if we mitigate the stress of performing something like that on Mars by prophylactically taking out the appendix? There's actually precedent for that on Earth. There is a Chilean settlement off Antarctica where anyone over the age of 6 to live there has to have their appendix out. We need to look at training differently because the activity that we're doing will be more different and more remote. So for example, we'll be doing surface EVA. So the communication and the risk mitigation will change. Preparing differently. So what happens when you have an outbreak, say COVID hits Mars? What about Marsdemic preparation? And then how do we enforce the standard of care to enact best practices for health and mental health? Do we create a Mars Health Organization? So these are all future-looking questions that we need to start thinking about now if we're serious about optimizing performance on Mars. And then the other question is there's actually a lot of benefit in what we've talked about today. I'm sure you're thinking, hey, resilience, salutogenesis, good expeditionary behavior, that actually could help me on my next expedition and my day-to-day interactions. So also bringing the benefits of this research back to Earth. So we've talked about a lot today. I know that we're coming to the end of our time. I know there's going to be a bunch of questions. So I hope that we achieved what we set out to talk about: the hazards of the spaceflight environment, optimizing performance, emerging technology and tools. There is no shortage of questions to be answered. I know there's a lot of researchers and budding scientists out there in the audience. So the bottom line is we need you, and answering these questions starts with a single step. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to you for questions.